There's an idea that's become very popular in modern magic and spirituality. The idea that we have somehow moved beyond hierarchy, that nobody should stand above anyone else, that teachers, grades, structures, apprenticeships, and initiations belong to an older, less enlightened age, and that the modern seeker is free to wander through the spiritual traditions of the world, taking whatever appeals to them, leaving whatever does not, and assembling a path entirely according to personal preference. On the surface, that sounds wonderfully liberating. Nobody gets to control you. Nobody gets to tell you what to believe. Nobody can claim authority over your spiritual life. You remain completely in charge of the journey. And I understand the appeal of that. I've never been somebody who believed that one tradition possesses all the whole truth. My own journey has wandered through more landscapes than I can probably easily list. And I've learned from different systems, different practices, and very different ways of understanding the sacred. So this is not an argument for locking yourself inside one institution and throwing away the key, nor is it an argument for surrendering your intelligence to somebody wearing an impressive robe. But I do think there is a serious problem hidden inside the modern rejection of hierarchy. Because if nothing is allowed to stand above our present understanding, then our present understanding becomes the highest point we can reach. If every teaching must agree with us before we accept it, nothing is ever given the opportunity to transform us. And if we only take the parts of a path that we already like, then the person choosing the path remains exactly the same person throughout. They may acquire new language, they may acquire new symbols, they may have some interesting experiences, but they remain fundamentally untouched. I think that is where a great deal of modern spirituality becomes stuck. We've confused equality of human worth with equality of knowledge. They're not the same thing. Every human being has equal value. It does not mean every human being has equal experience. It does not mean equal wisdom. It does not mean equal skill. It does not mean equal perception, understanding, or attainment. I'm not diminished because somebody knows more about music than I do. I'm not being oppressed because another musician can hear something in a piece that I cannot yet hear. I'm not surrendering my dignity because a crass person who has spent 40 years practicing possesses distinctions that are invisible to a beginner. That's not domination, that's reality. There are people who know more than we do. There are people who have traveled further in a particular directions. There are people who have made mistakes we have not yet made and learned lessons we have not yet reached. And sometimes the quickest way to move forward is to listen to them, not worship them, not obey them blindly. Listen to them, learn from them, and allow them to show us what we cannot yet see. Because one of the strangest ideas in modern spiritual culture is that admitting somebody knows more than us somehow makes us smaller. And I think the opposite is true. The ability to recognize knowledge is itself a form of maturity. There's no shame in being a beginner. There's no shame in saying, I don't know. There's no shame in standing at the foot of the mountain. The problem begins when we insist that the foot of the mountain is simply another version of the summit, because then nobody climbs. And there's another word that people have become really wary of: discipline. Discipline sounds restrictive. It sounds joyless. It sounds like somebody else imposing rules upon us. But without discipline from someone else or self-discipline, we remain at the mercy of preference. We practice when we feel inspired. We stop because we're bored. We remain with a teaching whilst it's exciting. We leave it when it becomes repetitive, difficult, or uncomfortable. And then we tell ourselves that we're following our intuition. Sometimes we are. Sometimes we have genuinely recognized that something is no longer right for us. But sometimes what we call intuition is simply resistance with better public relations. Sometimes this no longer resonates, means this has begun to challenge me. Sometimes, oh, I've outgrown this teacher, means this teacher's told me something I didn't want to hear. Sometimes I'm following my own path, means nobody is now allowed to correct me. And that can feel like freedom, but it may actually be a very sophisticated form of stagnation. Because the ego loves a path over which it retains complete authority. It loves being able to choose the practices that confirm it. It loves taking the most attractive parts of different traditions and leaving behind the demands that gave those practices depth. It likes the symbols without the discipline, the initiation without the preparation, the title without the responsibility, the mystery without the years of formation, and the experience without the framework required to understand it. And it especially likes teachers who continually tell it that it's already perfect. There's a whole spiritual industry built around telling people that there is nowhere to go, nothing to learn, nobody who knows more than they do. And there may be a level upon which that is profoundly true. At the deepest level, perhaps nothing is missing. Perhaps the sacred is already present. Perhaps the essential nature of the person requires no improvement. But that's not the same as saying that every expression of that person is equally developed. The piano may already contain every note. That does not mean I can sit down and play it beautifully. A person may contain extraordinary potential, and I truly believe we all do. That does not mean the potential has been realized. The seed contains the tree. The seed is not yet casting shade. Development matters, formation matters, practice matters, and hierarchy at its best exists to guide that process. When I use the word hierarchy, I'm not talking about one person being more valuable than another. I'm talking about levels of knowledge, responsibility, and development. The apprentice and the craftsperson are equal as human beings. They're not equal in their understanding of the craft. The student and the teacher are equal as human beings. They're not occupying the same place within the learning. And pretending that they are does not empower the student. It deprives them of the chance to become the teacher. A genuine hierarchy should not hold people permanently beneath it. It should lift them. It should transmit knowledge. It should deepen perception. It should make the person more capable. The teacher does not exist to remain forever above the student. The teacher exists to help the student climb, and perhaps in time, the student sees further than the teacher, and the pupil becomes the teacher, and the teacher becomes the pupil. And that really is not a failure of the hierarchy. That's its fulfillment. Of course, hierarchy can become corrupt. We all know that. People become intoxicated by titles. They start believing that a grade, office, or initiation makes them important. They surround themselves with people who agree with them, and they confuse obedience with loyalty. They use secrecy to avoid accountability. They make students dependent. They turn teaching into control. That's not healthy hierarchy. That is ego wearing ceremonial clothing. And it deserves to be challenged. But rejecting all hierarchy because some people abuse it is like rejecting medicine because some doctors are arrogant. The abuse does not remove the need. It means we require discernment. A healthy teacher does not need to make you feel small. They do not need to humiliate you in order to appear powerful. They do not demand control over areas of your life that have nothing to do with what they're teaching. They do not insist that questioning them is a spiritual failure. They do not make leaving impossible. And they certainly do not encourage you to abandon your own conscience. A healthy teacher increases your ability to think, perceive, and act. And a healthy teacher gradually replaces your judgment with theirs. A healthy teacher welcomes serious questions. An unhealthy teacher interprets questions as disloyalty. A healthy teacher can admit uncertainty. An unhealthy teacher must always appear to possess the answer. A healthy teacher wants you to develop and grow. An unhealthy teacher wants you to remain impressed. That distinction matters enormously, but once we've made it, we still have to face the uncomfortable truth that learning requires humility. It requires admitting that there are things we cannot yet see, and magic is a particularly dangerous area in which to assume that every impression is wisdom. The magical path involves imagination, dream, emotion, symbol, intuition, altered awareness, unexpected coincidence, inner voices, powerful, powerful experiences. And all of these can be profound, but they can also be misunderstood. We can feel something deeply, but still be wrong. We can have a dramatic experience and attach the wrong meaning to it. We can mistake intensity for truth. We can confuse fantasy with vision. That's one of the biggest problems with magic. We can mistake our own desires for guidance, and we can take an old fear and dress it in sacred language and obey it as a revelation. And if we have no teacher, no structure, no tested tradition, and no community capable of challenging us, we may simply ask ourselves whether our interpretation is correct, and then answer ourselves, then treat the answer as confirmation. It is a marvelously efficient, closed system. Nothing enters that might disturb it. And this is one of the reasons older magical traditions developed grades, stages, and periods of preparation. It's not merely about withholding secret information, it was about forming the person capable of receiving it. Because information is not the same as understanding. You can read an advanced text and understand every word without grasping what it's trying to do. You can copy a ritual perfectly without possessing the judgment required to work with it. You can learn the names, symbols, and gestures whilst remaining completely unchanged beneath it. A tradition at its best does not merely hand you techniques. It develops your capacity, it trains attention, it deepens patience, and it strengthens discernment. It teaches you to recognize the difference between imagination and self-deception, between a genuine movement and your own wishful thinking. And these distinctions are usually learned through experience, correction, and repetition. Not by reading one more book, not by collecting one more practice, not by declaring yourself advanced. You become capable by doing the work. And doing the work often means remaining with something after the excitement has disappeared. That is the part we do not talk about enough. Real growth is 9 times out of 10 as boring as hell. It's repetition, it's returning, it's trying again, it's listening to the same correction for the 5th, 6th, 7th time, practicing the foundation while somebody else appears to be performing something more impressive. You know, it's reading a passage again because you realize you did not actually understand it the first time, or the second time, or the third time, remaining with a question instead of rushing to announce an answer. There's little glamour in apprenticeship, and that is one of its strengths. The personality becomes bored and something deeper begins to develop. Modern spirituality often confuses novelty with progress. We move from one thing to the next, one system to another, because the next one feels exciting. We encounter a new set of symbols and assume we've reached a new depth. We learn new language and we mistake it for transformation, but sometimes we've not gone deeper. We've simply changed the scenery. It is possible to spend a whole lifetime beginning, always discovering a new tradition, always finding a new teacher, always announcing a new direction, always experiencing the excitement of entering, never remaining long enough to be changed. There's a type of spiritual life, really, it's spiritual magical tourism. You go and visit the bits that are attractive to you. You visit, you admire the surroundings. You take something attractive home with you. Enjoy telling people, oh, look where I've been, look what I've done. and then you leave before anyone asks you to do the washing up. Nothing wrong with tourism. It can be enjoyable, it can broaden the mind. It may even lead you towards somewhere you eventually choose to remain. Tourism's not apprenticeship. The playground is not initiation. The playground has its purpose. Play is important. Experimentation is important. Trying different things can help us discover what genuinely calls us. I'm not interested in taking that away from anyone. Stay in the playground for as long as you need. Explore, try things. Enjoy the symbols, the stories, the atmosphere, and the possibilities, but do not confuse play with mastery. At some point, a path asks more of us. At some point, it ceases to be entertainment. At some point, it asks for commitment. And initiation begins at that point where the path is permitted to change the person walking. That means the seeker is no longer the sole author of every term. Something is allowed to challenge them. Something is allowed to say, not yet. Something's allowed to say, you don't get this. Something is allowed to say, go back and practice the basics. And that can feel terribly restrictive to a culture that's taught us that personal preference is sacred. But preference is not always wisdom. We prefer what is familiar. We prefer what confirms us. The ego prefers what confirms us. Every spiritual path that's worth its salt says we have to go beyond the ego. We prefer, though, what makes us feel competent. We prefer what allows us to remain in control. The parts of a tradition we dislike may not automatically be the deepest parts. Some may be outdated, unnecessary, possibly even harmful. Traditions are human constructions and they carry human flaws. But some of the things we dislike may precisely be the things that expose our limitations. That's why discernment is different from preference. Preference asks, do I like this? Discernment asks, what is this doing? Is this discipline developing something in me? Is this teaching asking me to grow? Is this discomfort the result of manipulation or the discomfort of discovering that I may be wrong? Those are not always easy questions. That is part of why good teachers are valuable. A good teacher has often traveled through the stage you are currently in. They know the seductions of the beginning. They know how impressive the first experiences can feel. They know how easy it is to mistake a glimpse for attainment. They may recognize the trap because they once lived inside it, and they may save you years in your own studies and practices. Sometimes a strange pride in having to discover everything personally, as though taking guidance makes the discovery less authentic. We do not apply that principle elsewhere. We don't say that every musician should reinvent musical notation. Do not say that every builder should independently rediscover how walls remain standing. We learn from those who came before us. We receive what they learned, and then perhaps we build upon it. There's no special spiritual virtue in repeating every avoidable mistake. There's no prize for spending 30 years lost in a wood when somebody could have pointed out the path. You still have to walk it. Nobody can do that for you, but a guide can show you where the ground becomes dangerous. They can point out the turning that is easy to miss. They can recognize when you've begun walking in a circle while congratulating yourself on your progress. And that last one may be the most useful service a teacher can provide, because we're remarkably talented at mistaking activity for movement. We read constantly, we attend events, we discuss ideas, we collect practices, we have experiences. Are we actually changing? Are we becoming more perceptive, more honest, more grounded, more capable of holding complexity, more responsible for the effects we have upon others? Are we becoming more able to distinguish what is real from what we want to be real? Have we simply become better at describing ourselves as spiritual? A path should leave evidence. There should be some sort of difference between the person who began and the person who's practiced for 10 years. Not perfection, not superiority, but depth. There should be greater steadiness, greater perception, greater humility, capacity. If nothing's changed except the vocabulary, you may need to ask whether the path has actually been allowed to do anything. Hierarchy gives us a way of recognizing development, not a ladder of human worth. If you see it that way, you're misunderstanding it. A sequence of formation. The person at one stage is prepared for the next. They're not rewarded because they're important. They move because the foundations have been established, and those foundations matter. There are things that cannot be misunderstood. There are things that cannot be understood simply because somebody tells you. You have to become the kind of person who can recognize them. A child can be told what grief is, does not mean the child understands grief as somebody who's lived through loss understands it. A beginner can be told to listen more carefully. That does not mean they can hear the distinction an experienced practitioner hears. Knowledge is not merely data. It's also capacity. It's the ability to perceive what the information refers to, and that capacity develops gradually. It's why genuine initiation cannot be reduced to a ceremony. A ceremony may mark the threshold. It may concentrate the meaning of the transition. It may help the body and imagination recognize that something has changed. But the ceremony cannot create what the person has not become. A title does not produce maturity. A robe does not produce wisdom. A certificate does not produce perception. You can be declared an adept and still be a fucking idiot. You can possess a wonderful, impressive, magical name and remain incapable of listening to another person for 5 minutes. You can hold the highest grade in an organization and still behave like a badger trapped in a wheelie bin. The outer hierarchy can become completely detached from the inner development it was meant to represent. And that is when it becomes theatre, and perhaps this is why so many people reject hierarchy. They've seen the theatre, they've seen people using titles to compensate for lack of depth. Depth, maybe death as well. They've seen authority abused, they've seen systems more interested in preserving themselves than developing their members. That rejection is understandable. But the answer is not to abolish the idea that some people know more than others. The answer is to become much more better at recognizing the difference between status and attainment. Status says, you must listen to me because of who I am. Attainment says you may wish to listen because of what I can demonstrate. Status demands recognition. Attainment usually reveals itself through its fruits. Does this person help others become more capable? Do they live what they teach? Can they admit mistakes? Do they respect the boundaries of their knowledge? Do their students become stronger and more independent, or more frightened and dependent? Do they encourage discernment or demand belief? Do they point towards the work or continually point towards themselves? They're useful questions. The genuine teacher does not need to be and should not be perfect. No teacher is. Do not need to know everything. They cannot. They simply need to know the part of the road they are teaching better than the person who's asked for the help. And they need enough integrity not to pretend that this gives them authority over everything else. A person may be a brilliant magical teacher and terrible at relationships. They may understand ritual and know nothing about money. They may possess profound spiritual insight, be completely incapable of organizing a cupboard. Hierarchy should be specific. It should not expand into total authority. I can recognize somebody as my teacher in one area without treating them as the final authority of my life. That's mature hierarchy. It allows learning without worship, respect without surrender, humility without self-erasure. And maybe that's the balance we need to recover, because self-trust does matter. Many people have been taught not to trust themselves, been silenced, controlled, or made to feel that authority always belongs elsewhere. Learning to trust one's own experience can be a vital part of healing and growth, but self-trust does not mean believing ourselves infallible. I can trust myself and still recognize that I have blind spots. I can trust myself enough to risk correction. I can trust myself enough to choose a teacher without surrendering my conscience. I can trust myself enough to remain when the work is difficult, and I can trust myself enough to leave when the relationship becomes manipulative. That's much deeper than simply refusing all authority. Freedom is not the absence of commitment. Freedom is the ability to choose what is worthy of commitment. And commitment is where depth begins. You can paddle in 100 rivers and never discover what it means to be carried by one. You can read from every tradition and never allow a single one to become part of your life. You can remain open to everything and committed to nothing. Openness sounds so virtuous, but doors that remain permanently open do not create a home. At some point, we choose not necessarily forever, not blindly, but long enough for something to work upon us. Long enough for the excitement to pass, long enough for the difficult parts to appear, long enough for those parts of us that resist change to reveal themselves. That is when the path begins. Before that, we may simply just be browsing. And I think browsing is one of the defining habits of our time. We browse the internet, we browse ideas, identities, practices, we browse teachers. We give each one a few moments to impress us. If it fails, we move on. Responsibility is always placed upon the teaching to entertain the seeker. And the seeker is never required to become capable of receiving the teaching. But some things do not reveal themselves immediately. Some teachings remain closed until the person has developed the patience, experience, and sensitivity required to understand them. It's not elitism, it's true of every serious art. A complicated piece of music does not become meaningless because a beginner cannot yet hear what makes it beautiful. The beginner grows into the ability to hear it. Sometimes the teacher's role is simply to say, keep listening. Not everything that feels incomprehensible is profound. There's definitely plenty of nonsense in the world. But neither is everything we fail to understand necessarily nonsense. Sometimes we've not yet developed the organs of perception, and that is the deeper purpose of training. It changes the person who is looking. The teacher may begin by giving information, but the real work is the development of perception. Before learning, two things may appear identical. After learning, the difference becomes obvious. You suddenly hear what you could not hear. You notice what was previously invisible. You recognize a pattern that had always been present. And once seen, it's difficult to understand how you ever missed it. That is growth. Not simply knowing more facts, seeing differently. We cannot always teach ourselves to see what we do not know is there, which is why something must occasionally stand above our current understanding. Not above our human worth, above our present level of perception. Maybe a teacher, a tradition, maybe a disciplined practice. It may be a community that holds certain standards. It may be an old text that refuses to flatten itself into whatever we already believe. It may be life itself. But something must be able to say, there is further to go. Otherwise, our present self becomes the ceiling, and perhaps that's the clearest way I can put this. If you want to remain in the playground, pick a mix is fine. The playground could be colourful, interesting, comforting, familiar, entertaining, and you can collect what pleases you and leave behind whatever does not. And you can remain entirely in control. But the playground has no initiation, because initiation requires transformation, and transformation requires us to encounter something that does not merely reflect us back to ourselves. Something that asks more of us, something that challenges the limits of who we currently are. Something that sees a possibility in us that we've not yet developed the capacity to inhabit. A teacher at their best serves that possibility. They are not there to be worshipped. They're not there to keep us below them. They are there because they have traveled far enough to recognize where we are standing. They turn around, they point, they say, the ground is unstable there. The path bends this way. You're not seeing this clearly yet. Go back, try again, slow down, listen, and perhaps eventually you no longer need me for this. That's healthy hierarchy, not the hierarchy that keeps people beneath, the hierarchy that draws people onward. Not a pyramid of value, a chain of transmission. One person learns from another and carries the work further. The purpose is not to preserve the authority of the teacher, it is to continue the possibility of growth. So I do not believe we've moved beyond hierarchy. I think we have sometimes moved beyond the ability to speak about it sensibly. We have treated every difference in knowledge as a threat to equality, and in doing so, we risk flattening every path until nothing remains except personal preference. But personal preference cannot initiate us. It can only select from what we already understand. A path begins when we allow ourselves to encounter what we do not yet understand. And perhaps that requires one of the simplest, most difficult magical acts. To say, I do not know. And someone else may see this more clearly. I'm willing to learn. It's not a weakness. It's the opening of the path, the beginning of the journey. So explore, play, gather, question everything. Keep your discernment. Do not hand your soul to anyone. But also do not make the opposite mistake of believing that your present understanding is the highest authority in the universe. Find people who know what you wish to learn. Look carefully at the lives they produce around them. Listen to what they say. Notice what they do. Remain responsible for your choices. And when you find someone worthy of being heard, be teachable. Because there is no shame in following the footsteps of someone who already knows the way. You still have to walk. You still have to discover what the road means for you. You may eventually leave the road and make another, but you do not have to waste a lifetime proving that guidance was unnecessary. At some point, growth requires humility. At some point, the path requires commitment. At some point, initiation requires that something be allowed to stand beyond who we are now. And if we refuse that completely by picking and mixing, we may remain free to choose anything. But we may never become anyone different. Hope you've enjoyed this Saturday Grove. It's been quite a long one, but I've enjoyed sharing it with you, my usual rambles and thoughts. Comment, do subscribe, do follow, and I will see you again next Saturday for the Saturday Grove. Do remember, if we get 100 followers on the Grove, then we'll start doing some live videos. It'll be great to connect that way with you. Anyway, much love, many blessings. I got so into that, I've just realised my chair's a lot lower than normal, and so I look really short. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.